Let me say a couple things before we start on the worksheet. Number one, it is irrelevant if you call it the Trinity. A lot of atheists and skeptics get all ticked off. That's a man-made art. That's just man-made, made up. Trinity's nowhere in the Bible. That's exactly right. The word Trinity is a Latin word, Trinitas. Later on, not tonight, I'll talk about who first used it and the authors used it and why they did. Trinitas is, so of course, triune. So it's 3 in 1. Call it shkabula. Who gives a rip? A word was used to describe how the Father, Son, and Spirit relate to one another. That's it. Make up a word if you want. And they did make up a word, Trinitas. But that's not in the Bible. Fine. If you don't like it, discard it. So let's don't get caught up, and I encourage you, don't let skeptics or atheists or people who are like, well, where's that in the Bible? That's just a red herring. It's just, as we get on, who cares? It is an attempt to explain who God is. Who cares what you call it? So say, look, if that's bothersome for you, fine. I won't use the word again. Now the next question is, let's describe who God is. And the Christian conception of God is, there is one God and 3 persons. One God and 3 persons. I know, and I'll explain all that over and over and over again. One God and 3 persons. It's not one person and 3 persons. It's not one God and 3 gods. It's one God and 3 persons. And a person is different from a God, and I'll explain all that as we go along. And I promise it will be not as clear as mud. But my first point right now is, don't worry about the term Trinity. If you don't like it, if you're skeptics, get all upset. It's not in the Bible, New Testament. It's a term early church fathers used to try to figure out how to talk about how the Father, Son, and Spirit are both 3 in 1. So they came with the word Trinitas. Okay. Later on, I'll say a lot more about that. So instead of us saying, you can look at it this way. So on my handout, when I say an introduction to the Trinity, I could just as easily have said, and I thought about this, an introduction to the concept of the Christian God. Does that make sense? But that's synonymous. The concept of the Christian God is Trinitarian. The Christian God is Trinity. It is unique. There's no religion in the world that believes in a 3 in 1. None besides Christianity. So that is synonymous. Christian God and Trinity go hand in hand. So much so, if you don't believe in the Trinity, that's one of the major demarcations of Orthodox Christianity. So Mormons do not believe in a Trinity at all. There's 3 different gods, 3 different beings. Mormons are not part of the Orthodox Christianity. And on you might go, Jehovah's Witnesses, others, and they're all kind of people that are problematic. So if you get bogged down with Trinity, which look like your faces, maybe you're not, that's fine. But for my podcast listeners, that is quite irrelevant. The next thing I want to say this, and we're going to look at our sheet. The next thing I want to say is this. How did we today get to this concept? Why does it matter? And a simple answer is, it came from hundreds and now thousands of years of Christian reflection on how they experienced God. So the earliest Jews and the earliest Jewish Christians experienced God in a certain way. And then they wrote scripture about it. And then they reflected on the scripture. But how do we experience God? We experience a God, not a bunch of gods, and so forth. So it arose out of their reality of experience. I'll tease through the years, I'll say, some people will probably think, let's develop a Trinity. That's confusing. They'll believe it. It sounds so complex. No, it wasn't a bunch of guys sitting around going, just gambling. Hey, let's make up something dumb. It came from their experience. And so the first place we always start when we understand God, for us, of course, is Scripture. And that's exactly why we're going to start there. Tonight will be a lot of Scripture. So if you have a Bible app, that'll be helpful. We'll just flip through a bunch of Bible verses. It starts from the Bible. Okay, now I'm on the worksheet. Oh, any question or comments what I said? If nothing, we'll get going. So just the very top here, the only page we have, I'll say page 1, it's the very top. Monotheism is a modern term. It is nowhere in the Bible. Mono means one. Theism from theos means God. Monotheism literally means one God. Monotheism means one God. Today you would define it as, I just got this right off of Google, as the doctrine or belief, actually I reworded it to be better, that only one God exists. Only one God exists. Now stay with me here. That is a metaphysical definition. Only one God exists. Only one Chelsea exists. There's no other Chelsea in the universe. We would say that's a metaphysical principle. There's only one Chelsea. There's not versions of you, parallel Chelseas, people who are kind of like, there's one person with your particular DNA in the world. You're it. Monotheism, a modern definition, is only one God exists. No other. That's like saying no other humans exist but Chelsea. Now, that modern definition is problematic when you examine the Bible. Why is it problematic when you examine the Bible? Well, right away, this is the definition of anachronism. That is, when you have a modern concept and you go back to an ancient document and go, I don't see it anywhere. It's because you're applying a modern principle. If I said Freudian psychology, where's that in Hebrews? Well, okay, that's anachronism. What kind of car did Jesus drive? That's an anachronism. You're on the wrong time zone or wrong time frame. That's how it is with the term monotheism. So we're not looking for the term monotheism in the Bible. We're trying to think of how do they understand God? That's the right question to ask. As always, how did they understand God? And in scholarship, we still use the word monotheism, but it's defined differently. And I'll tell you what that is a little bit. But first, here's why it's problematic. Look on the handout there. Here's why it's problematic to say that all ancient Jews believe only one God exists. The problem with that is the Hebrew Bible refers to many, or the Old Testament, refers to many heavenly creatures. And they'll call them gods. And typically, like in Genesis 6:2 and in Job 1:6, and also in Psalms, they're called sons of God. But they're called gods, little gods, sons of gods. So let's just very briefly, let's look at some of those Bible verses. If you have your Bible app or your Bible, if you do have a Bible app, it might save us some time. We'll go through a little quickly here. That's right. What do you mean? So Genesis, I'm just going to tell you, Genesis 6:2 is when it says the sons of God had sex with the women, and supposedly they had giants. Okay, that's Genesis 6:2. The sons of God saw that the daughters of humankind were beautiful, thus they took wives for themselves from any of they chose. That the sons of God, B'nai HaElohim, occurs only here in Job 1:6-1 and 38:7. Now scholars debate who these sons of God are, but nevertheless it shows up there. But these are some kind of apparently divine figures, you might say, some divine. If you look to go to Job 1:6. Job 1:6. It's a perfect example. Most scholars think that sons of God refers to is another way of saying angel. In Job 1:6, now the day came when the sons of God, that exact same expression, came to present themselves before Yahweh, and Satan, or it's not Satan, it's not Satan, he doesn't have a name, and the accusing one also arrived among them. And then the context throughout Job, these sons of gods almost certainly seem to be synonymous with angelic beings. Technically speaking, it's just spiritual beings. An angel is a spiritual being that conveys a message.
Mine says heavenly beings.
Heavenly beings, okay.
One day the heavenly beings came to present themselves.
The heavenly beings, yeah, good.
Mine actually does say angels.
And yours says angels. What translation is that?
NIV.
NIV, and what's your translation?
In, I think, the New Standard.
The New Standard, okay. So heavenly beings, angels,
New Revised.
New NRSV. And you notice how it says angel. This is a good just interpretive issue. Again, in Hebrew, it's sons of God. And they interpret that, the translators, as what they really mean are angels. Does that make sense? And that's fine sometimes. The only problem technical that being is angelos, angel, means messenger. Not all spiritual beings, heavenly beings, are messengers. That's like calling every single spiritual being a plumber. Well, they're not all plumbers, or whatever it is. They're not all their job. That's the one difficulty sometimes with saying the word angel. If you turn to Psalm, let's say go to Psalm 82:6. Psalm 82:6. Verse 6, I thought you are gods, all of you are sons of the Most High. Yet you will die like mortals, you will fall like all the other rulers. He's talking about, well, okay, I will give you some context. He's talking about the local Canaanite gods. They lived in Canaan, and the chief Canaanite king of their headship, and I'll talk more about it a little bit, their headship, their pantheon, all the Supreme Court, as it were, the head god was called El. And El is exactly the word used for God, Yahweh, in the Bible many times. He was their supreme God. And when Canaanites talked about that, those other gods, pantheon or their team of gods, they called them the sons of God, the sons of the Most High. El Elyon, the Most High. And he says, I thought you're gods, verse 7, but you're going to die like mortals. So at least he's acknowledging that. So I could go on for a long time, but if you'll go back to your handout, that as you see these examples throughout, particularly in the Psalms, where these other quote-unquote gods or sons of gods are mentioned, angels sometimes are mentioned and they seem, they're other heavenly beings, of course, the assembly of the holy ones. So these beings exist, and the term that's used, sons of God, is a very special term. That doesn't mean they think they are like God's status, for sure, but in other words, here's my point. If you're a strict monotheist and think only God exists and nothing else divine exists at all, nothing other heavenly creature, well, then you're sunk on that. If you think only a God like Him exists, there's some more biblical references for that. So look in that same handout there. However, I said, there are verses that say that only God exists. Now, I want to look at several verses here that demonstrate that. So let's turn to Exodus 8:10. He said, tomorrow, and Moses said, it will be as you say, so that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. It's like Yahweh our God. There's no one like Him. Now, you could argue He just means like Him. Some might say, no, that means there's no one like Him whatsoever. That's, some of those phrases a little problematic to be exact, but some are not problematic to be exact. Go to Deuteronomy 4. Some are quite specific. 4:35. Deuteronomy 4:35. There's a lot of verses like this in the Bible here, in the Old Testament particularly. But Deuteronomy 4:35 says, you have been taught that Yahweh alone is God. There is what? No other besides Him. No other besides Him. Go down to verse 39, the same book, verse 39. Today realize and carefully consider that Yahweh is God in heaven, above, and on earth below. There is no other. 2 Samuel 7:22, a prophet. 2 Samuel 7:22. Therefore you are great, O Yahweh God, for there is none like you. There is no God besides you. What we have heard is true. And we could go on for a while if you want, and I'm more than happy to. 1 Kings says the same thing. 1 Chronicles 17:20. Isaiah says it over and over. Oh, let's go to Isaiah. There's kind of a classic text that at least you ought to be exposed to if you haven't already. Let's go to Isaiah 43:10. 43:10, and then there's a couple places. Isaiah loves to do this one. So Isaiah 43:10, you are my witnesses, says Yahweh, my servant whom I have chosen, so that you may consider and believe in me, and understand that I am He. No God was formed before me, and none will outlive me. That's pretty explicit, don't you think?
I am the Lord, and besides me
there is no other. No deliverer besides me. That's right, in verse 11. That's exactly right. 44:6. This is what Yahweh, Israel's king, says, their protector. Yahweh who commands armies. I am the first, I am the last. There is no God but me. Go down to verse 8. Don't panic, don't be afraid. Did I not tell you beforehand to decree it? You are my witnesses. Is there any God but me? There's no other sheltering rock. I know of none. I love that. I don't know anybody. We go on in chapter 45, the same thing. Isaiah makes fun of all the other gods. I mean, he goes on and on. There's no one else beside me. Who else are you going to go to? And that's the Old Testament. In the New Testament, you have references to, and I'm not going to spend too much energy, but I wanted you to see that in the Bible, there is a consistent message. So let's go, Mark 12:29, Jesus says, he quotes from the Decalogue. Let's actually go to a classic text in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 8. 1 Corinthians 8. This is one of the earliest known verses to put Jesus inside the same, you might say, identity of God. Now, everybody believes in Judaism there's only one God. It says in verse 4, 1 Corinthians 8:4. Paul's talking to the Corinthians about eating food to idols, and some say, it's a big deal. Others say, it's not a big deal. And Paul's like, it's not a big deal. The idols aren't even real. This is what he says in verse 4. With regard then to eating food sacrificed to idols, we know that an idol in this world is nothing, but that there is no God but one. If after all there if after all there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we live, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we live. So that agency, through whom we live. I will come back to that later on, because I'll come back to these two verses. But this is astounding for a first century Jew to give the example that the Lord Jesus is the agent of creation. If you're a Jew, and I'll say this when we get to it again, I'm just worth repeating though, in Judaism, the only agent of creation was God's wisdom or His Word, and that is God. I mean, that's God kind. Angels weren't part of creation. Jews weren't part of creation. Moses and Muhammad weren't part of creation. I mean, it's a big deal. And so you can look at Ephesians 4, 4-6, 1 Timothy 1:17, 2:5, 6, and James 2:19, Jude 25. On and on and on it goes. There's one God, one God, one God, one God, one God. It is safe to say, I want this to sink in, because when you talk to people who are not Christians, particularly if they're of a different religion, y'all believe in three gods. Please understand, at zero time in the history of Judaism or Christianity have we ever believed that there's more than one God. You could not get more univocal. You can't. It is all these verses. It is a constant thread. Having said that, historians very much debate to the degree to which ancient Jews really did think only one God exists. It's probably the case if Sarah wanted to time travel. I want to go back to the 7th century BC, and I go up there with my microphone and interview, "Dear Jew, do you believe that other gods exist?" The odds are fairly high they would say, "Yes, but I only worship one," or "I worship Yahweh also." The prophets came along constantly and said, "Knock it off. Stop doing it." Now, why would they say knock it off unless they're doing it? So the average Jew probably did believe some of these other Canaanite gods were up there, and I'll talk about more in a second. We're going to go there a lot more. What I'm saying is, when someone says, you might hear this sometimes, you watch on TV and they'll say, I don't know, some special on History Channel, "I heard the Bible, they did believe in a lot of gods." No. The question is, did the average Jew? They might have. Did Judaism teach it? At least by the 5th and 6th century BC, probably after the Babylonian exile, they taught one God, at least by the Babylon. That's around 500 or so BC, 587. But anyway, you're talking about 5th, 6th century BC. At least by then, we know that Jews apparently continually taught that. That doesn't mean every person believed it. Again, how many Christians are solely devoted to Jesus and do whatever He wants? That doesn't mean scriptures don't teach it. It just means that, does that make sense what I'm saying? So what they did in practice is one thing, but the fact that Judaism in general taught it is a very ancient concept. And at least several centuries before Jesus, it was the standard view there's one God. It was bizarre. You need to understand, in the ancient world, everybody believed there were multiple gods. There's no such thing as an atheist in the ancient world. They believe in no God. It just doesn't exist. Everyone believed it. So David, wait a second. What about that time in Akhenaten in Egypt? In Aten, that one time. There was one time in the history of Egypt. There really was one time in the history of Egypt where one pharaoh said, "I want us to all worship the sun god." So what happened was he got rid of some whole other cults or different temples, and some he just diminished. And he tried his best to have everyone worship one God. And he did it happen for a few years, and it was such a success that when he died, they immediately got rid of everything he did and went back the way it was before. That's what they do to Obama when Trump gets in office. He revoked, and they hated it. They hated it. It was against all their grain to do that. And scholars debate how much that was monotheism, and it might have been a version of that, and that's fine. But most would say at minimum what it was, I'm introducing a term here, it's not on your paper, because I'll probably bring this up later on, is called henotheism. Heno. You can really impress your friends now. Heno theism. Like monotheism, henotheism. That is the belief or the doctrine that there is one chief God who is worshipped above other gods. So you do not deny the other gods exist. They're just minor gods. You might say demigods. That's henotheism. It's difficult to tell how much the early Jews were in fact henotheists. Yahweh's the chief god, and there's other gods. It seems to me, based on my research, maybe early on, there was some of that going on. But by the time, I think around at least by the Babylonian exile, that had mostly gone away. And what became under Josiah's reform is much more what we call a monotheism. That there's one God, the other gods are so feckless and powerless, they don't even matter. They don't even, in that sense, don't exist. But Egyptians, under that one little slice of time, is either that was monotheism or a henotheism. That is, Ra, the sun god, is the chief one. Does that make sense? I want to move on. I just want to, if you hear that, just the other day I did a podcast of this atheist on YouTube who said, did you not know? And she was real snotty about that, which even if they did have a monotheism for a second, guess what we would say is that you're onto something. Because polytheism is nonsense. So good for you. But unfortunately, the Egyptians were not ready for that. So outside of that one little baby slice of time, really, the Jews were the only people group we have in recorded history to argue that only one God should be worshipped. I want that to sink in. That's a big, big deal in the history of the planet. And they said this in an environment where everybody believed there were many, many, many gods. They were persecuted for it. They were made fun of for it, you might say. They were ostracized. Warfare happened. They were exiled all the time. And at no time, as far as we can tell, did this Jewish belief diminish. Never mind, forget it. And that goes all the way forever. All the first, second century, they were still either looked down upon. They were looked down upon because of their belief in one God. Even the Roman Empire, they were looked down upon a lot. That the people are crazy. That's point one. And point two, I'm doing something a little different here that you usually don't hear in Trinitarian studies. Extra tip, icing. See, that's in this growth group. I do want to talk, that's step one. The reason why I do the step two is because, one, most Christians don't know this, and I like to inform because it's really good. Two, it's going to help you read the Bible better. But three, and this is the part that's really important to me, because if I were to interview an ancient Jewish person and go, tell me about God, they would not say, let me tell you about his ontology, his essence, his being, his metaphysics. They won't do that. They would not have done that. They would have said, let me tell you how God behaves. Let me tell you his characteristics. And if I said, well, is God, the God you worship, what's his name? They probably wouldn't pronounce it. But let's pretend for a second they pronounce it and say, well, let's say it's Yahweh. Okay. So is he the same or different? They would say, some things are similar. There's some traits that we kind of borrow concepts, analogies from our neighbors. Some, but in general, we have a very different conception of God. And if I said, is that because God's essence is his being, his deep ontological? And they would say, we don't think that way. I said, well, how do you think? They're going to say, we think more about how God behaves and his character. And I'll say, well, then tell them about his character. Does that make sense? They won't say, he's Trinitarian, monotheistic, metaphysical. They're not going to do that. So since they don't, I thought it was interesting for a second to reflect on how they would have thought about it. Because in a little bit, next couple of weeks, I'm going to start smuggling in early church fathers and whatever. They don't think like ancient Hebrews. That's problematic for you and me sometimes. We're not going to read our Bible, and I'm looking for later terms like Trinity to show up in the Old Testament. It can be real confusing. And I like for the Bible, made the Bible, I want it to speak for itself. Does that make sense? So let's look at some ways, if you've never thought about this, the ways that God was described as distinct. So again, Chelsea, if you time travel and you interview the person and say, tell me about your gods. Let's imagine you're a thoroughgoing Christian and a Jew or whatever. And you are monotheistic, only one God. And you say, well, let's chat on the couch here. Tell me about your gods. And they tell all about their gods. I put this as number two. In the A&E, that's the ancient Near East. That's very common shorthand in fellowship. In the ancient Near East, gods operated in a pantheon, and they made decisions in their divine assembly. So Chelsea said, well, I don't know what that means. And the Canaanite would say, what that means is, we don't just have one God. You say, what? What in the world? And you say, well, no. One God? That's crazy, Chelsea. Well, there are many, many gods. And you might say, well, then how do they work together? And they say, well, they work together like a council. They hang out together. They work out. They work together. We call that a pantheon. You say, tell me more about that. Well, there's a chief god, and he's got gods beneath him and her. And you said her. And they go, yeah, of course there's her. They have lovers. They have consorts, lovers. And they're very, very powerful, important goddesses. Absolutely. And you say, like whom? Well, you don't know Ashtarte? You don't know Baal's lover? You don't know about El? And what? You say, no, I don't know. There's only one God. They say, knock it off with this one God nonsense. There's many gods, and they have a level, and they each have lovers, and then they have children. And so as you would listen, you would realize that when they describe the gods sound like big, fat, days of our lives humans. Just like the Greeks later on would do, and the Romans. That's exactly how they conceived of them. They act just as petty, frail, blah, 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 as a human does. And Chelsea said, well, how do they come to decisions? They say, oh, they get together and have a divine assembly. Like they hold court. They get together and say, let's chat about this. Well, do they ever get along? Do they always get along? They would say, no, they don't. They have warfare all the time. They would say, where do you think creation came from? I'd say, what? They said, yeah, that's how creation started. There was a war. If you were Babylonian, they would say, like Marduk and, you don't remember Marduk and, Elish, that means one on high, and you don't remember in Tiamat, and you don't remember that? Marduk defeated Tiamat, broke up the body, became the earth, and the blood became the oceans. You don't know your early Bible stories? You say, what are you talking? Like, that's their concept. You would have heard story after story of these are the days of our life, these long sagas of the gods being swayed by emotions and powers beyond them, and they're bound by these powerful forces at work and all. You go on and on. Everybody believed that. The Egyptians were a little different because their gods were represented as animals. Other groups didn't do that as much. The Egyptians were very well known for animal representations, like snakes and wolves and all that stuff, or hyenas and all that. But nevertheless, they're all very similar in that regard. And then they met a Jew. Chelsea the Jew says, let me tell you about Yahweh. We have a very different conception of God. I hear what you're saying, that there's a divine figure that's above humans, but it sounds to me like these are like superhuman creatures that are like us, and they're just as petty and whatever. That's not the God at all, it is. Now, I'm trying to let it sink in, because that's how radical this was. That means their next door neighbors, if they were Canaanites, had a radically different understanding of how the world worked. Now, I'm trying to make this real for you. If they went out to go plant a garden, they didn't think, I praise God for it. They thought there were gods who ruled over the gardens. They offered sacrifices at foreign temples. They could have sex at the temple because they thought at the temple Baal, the fertility cult, you had to have sex to remind the gods to wake up and have babies too. That is to say, and have produce and fruit for you, and the fruit and the vegetables. And if you didn't, there's something wrong with you. I mean, their whole lifestyle was this way. You had a God for everything. All ancient people thought that. And that went all the way up to the Greeks, Romans. They never stopped believing it. Very, very common. Okay, when you study the Old Testament carefully, you see there are big differences. Okay, here's the first one. A huge distinction is that Yahweh, and I hadn't said this yet, Yahweh is God's covenantal name. Remember when Moses showed up to the burning bush that was not being consumed, he said, who shall I say that sent me? And he says in Hebrew, I am that I am, is a possible translation, and I might do a study on the sermon on that sometime too. It can be I am who I am that I am. If it comes from that Hebrew word, it can come, and some scholars say it's much more likely, it comes from a different Hebrew root word, which means to cause to be. That is to say, he might be saying, my name is the one who causes to be. That is, I am the creator. And both are, I've read really good arguments for the other one too. So anyway, let's call him Yahweh because that's how it was called, but you won't have a Jew ever write the word or even say it, because don't mispronounce it. Anyway, okay. This is very important. In the ancient world, Yahweh's power is absolute. It is never shared. Ever, ever, ever. He has no other sidekick gods. Now, I want to come back to those verses in a second to prove it. Other gods aren't non-existent, per se. They just possess no power or authority.
Then why call them gods?
Then why call them gods? Well, that's a great question. That's why so many, those verses we read, like in Isaiah and some many places, they'll say there are no other gods beside me. This is from Jews. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So this is what a Jew would say. A Jew would say, it's not that they don't exist, they don't possess power or authority. And their acknowledgement that they exist is implicit. I'm going to give you some verses in a second to show what I'm talking about. It's a good question. Which means they don't deserve to be worshipped. You need to let that sink in. Jews worshipped only the ones who had the most power. All ancient people did that. Why do you worship the gods? Because they have complete authority over your life. Jews said, right, but there's only one of them. Which means you don't worship the other ones. They don't have any power. Only one has absolute power. Thus, here's the key. Here's the difference. Here's a biblical definition. Biblical monotheism is the belief that only one supreme being is sovereign over all other beings. Biblical monotheism is the belief that only one supreme being is sovereign over all other beings. That's different from saying no other gods exist. Instead, it's saying only one has all the power. One's got all the cards. Does that make sense? And the sole aspect of reality which escapes God's complete power is human free will. That's the only thing. Now, why is that? Because He created humans with a capacity to resist His will. Let that sink in. He created us to be like that. He was not forced to have to live all these daggum humans. I didn't ask for it. It's like family. I didn't ask for that dumb brother or sister. Well, that's not how it is a God. He wasn't forced to be with us and, oh, they don't do what I make them do. He created us with the capacity to say, I don't want to do that, which of course is evil. Let's look at some Bible verses to prove that. Now, this is all through the Bible. Let's look at some classic standard texts. Exodus 20, verse 1. These are kind of the go-to verses. Exodus 20, verse 1. There are two places in the Old Testament which speak of what we call the Decalogue, or the Ten Commandments. It's in Exodus and Deuteronomy. Here's the Exodus version. Exodus 20, verse 1. God spoke all these words. I, Yahweh, am your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt, from the house of slavery. By the way, that's common in the Old Testament to say, I'm the God who did something for you. It's not just, I'm the God who has a divine essence and being and substance. I'm the God. Don't you remember me? I saw you last week. It's that kind of God. Verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me or before my face. No, she said, is after you okay? That's great. No, the preposition just means before me in place of worship and honor. If you said, William, you should have no other women before me, you said, well, after me is cool. You say, no, that's not my point. Well, you misunderstand. That there's nothing that gets more precedence. You can know other females. None of them make it to the top like I do. Nothing makes the top of it. So it implies there are other gods because they can't have them before them. It doesn't say there are no other gods. It says you shall have no other gods before me. And that's what I'm saying, the implicit. Verse 4, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, that's an idol, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water below. Now, why is that? Because everybody else did that. They made an image or an idol, usually of wood or clay or stone, and then they would dress it up, and they would bow down to it, pray to it, anoint it, give it food and water, because they assumed that God's powers were right there and that God represented the gods. And God says, don't do that. If you do that, you're going to want to worship them. Look in verse 5. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord, I, Yahweh, your God, am a jealous God, responding to the transgression of fathers by dealing with children, blah, 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 blah. So don't do that. And later on, we'll see in a second, well, I think so, in Deuteronomy, don't make any graven image at all. He also means, of course, of him. God is saying, I'm not like the other gods. You cannot make a physical representation of me. I'm not a creature. I'm not a snake. I'm not a hyena. I'm not even a human form. Don't do it. If you make an image, you think you can control me and manipulate me like they think they can do with Baal. And that's not how I roll. I'm not a creature. You can't rub my feet with oil and think I'm going to give you a little scratch on your back. That's not how it works. Look in Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy 6, verse 13. You must revere Yahweh your God, serve him, and take oaths using only his name. That is, you don't swear by the god of Baal. You don't swear by the god of Asherah. You must not go after other gods, those of the surrounding peoples. For Yahweh your God, who is present among you, is a jealous God, and his anger will erupt against you and remove you from the land. Why in the world is he so jealous? Well, he's just a petulant, dumb God. That's what a lot of atheists will say. Is my wife petulant and stupid because she says, I'm jealous if you go flirt off to little women and want to go have sex with them? She's not being stupid. It's perfectly legitimate to demand absolute fidelity. And that's exactly what they're saying, that God. I'm going to come out there in a little bit later on. Deuteronomy 10:17. Deuteronomy 10:17. For Yahweh your God is a God of gods and the Lord of lords. Listen to that. The God of gods, the Lord of lords. Lord means boss, ruler. He's chief. Yahweh is God of God. The great, mighty, and awesome God who is unbiased and takes no bribe, who just treats the orphan and widow, who loves resident foreigners, giving them food and clothing. He's the chief God. He's above all. And we go on even 32:39. So in the Bible, it's not so much that, I will say this one more time, move on unless you have a question. It's not so much in the Bible, particularly even in the Old Testament, that they deny other foreign gods exist. It's much more the demand not to worship them. Why? Because they're powerless. God is the ultimate supreme authority. If you worship them, that's idolatry. You're worshiping nonsense. And in modern terms, that might bother us. You go, I just wish they'd say they're not real at all. But they don't say that. But it is kind of like saying that when you don't worship them. In the deaf community, if you really are angry, this is a very big no-no. If you're really angry at a person, their sign language, they're signing to you, you look away. That's just like covering your ears. La 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 la. How rude is that? If I'm in the middle of, yeah, tell me some more, Chelsea. La la la. How mad would you be at your kids if you did that? Well, in the deaf community, it's like looking away. If I look away and I can't hear you for a second, if I don't see you, I'm a distance here, Sarah, you don't exist. In the sense that I'm not like paying enough attention. Does that make sense? And in Judaism, that's how they treated the other gods. So the question is, do they really think Sarah disappeared? Does that make sense? If I'm not giving you due attention, the text doesn't say. So are they strict modern term monotheists? They don't exist? Or is it more of a functional monotheism? That is, they may acknowledge they're out there, but they're feckless. They're worthless. I don't even look at them. We know that's true at least. Does that make sense? That's true at least. So Yahweh's power is absolute. It is not shared. And I'm telling you, every other people group thought that about their gods. The power was shared. It was joint. In our marriage, our power is shared. My power is not absolute. Ask my wife that. She'll tell you. I'm just kidding. That's kind of a joke, right? Because she's going to, that's right, man. No, it's shared. It's completely shared. If I was absolute, she had no say at all, that's how I'd be Yahweh. But we're not like Yahweh. We have shared power. And everybody else, the Canaanite gods, Babylonian, Mesopotamian, everybody. Another major distinction is he's personal. People can relate directly to him. Ancient people did believe that the gods might listen, you can pray to them. But this idea that God can relate directly to Abraham and directly to Moses and directly, the sense of, oh, I know that God. I can pray to him directly and I can talk to him. He talks to me. That the degree to which he's given a personal nature is unique. The degree to which he is so personal is unique. Third, he has completely, utterly free will. That is unlike every other god in the ancient world. In this time period, no outside force, energy, or being ever compels or thwarts him. I want that to sink in. God has perfect boundaries. Nobody can manipulate him. Nobody can, think about it, you can't make God feel guilty. By the little footnote, a lot of people have a problem in prayer life. Well, I don't want to bother God one more time. They smuggle in it because I bothered my mom or dad and I got fussed at. God's not like that. Jesus, in fact, tells a story. It's like the woman who goes, hey, let me in. He tells a parable. He says, if the guy answers the door for her, how much more your Heavenly Father? He doesn't say, don't do it. God will be ticked off. He'll get all mad at you. That's not what it says. So nothing compels him. He's completely free. And here's one example of that. In Genesis, God, how does creation come about? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, heavens and earth were void, and the Spirit were on the waters, and so forth. He just creates it. And then God said, let there be, right? He spoke. That's all it is. He spoke. That's it. I'm trying to tell you here, nowhere in the ancient world thought that way about their gods. Everybody else had a very different understanding of how creation happened. They thought the gods either had a fight, like Marduk and Tiamat. That's called a theomachy, for a god war, god battle. They had a fight, a battle, and Marduk beat Tiamat, and the body became the earth, and the blood became the water. That was common, warfare. Another one was that a goddess gave birth to creation, birthed out creation. Or, humans come from semen, spit, all kinds of stuff. And so we come out of the substance, the stuff of the gods. And the warfare was a very common one. There's battles and or they got divine assembly together. And here comes these Jews who go, no. Sit down. This is a lot easier than you think it is. He just spoke it. Why did it happen? I mean, who made him? Nobody made him. Well then, who's fighting against him? No one's fighting against him. No one fights him. There's no one even barely equal. He doesn't fight. There's some references in the Psalms about him kind of fighting over the raging sea. Okay, yeah, but the sea doesn't really fight him. That probably comes from the old... Anyway, that's a long story. So I say that here in your handout, there's no war. He has no input. No one gives him advice in that sense. There's no material birth. He didn't birth us. He's completely free. He chose to create. That is unique. And by unique, by the way, unique doesn't mean special. It means inimitable. There's nothing like it. You can't be very unique. You're just unique. You can be very special. So when I say the word unique, I'm using the technical sense, the right one. It's unique. In the ancient world, no other person thought this way. That'd have been crazy talk to think God is completely free and no one's there to tell him how to do it. Another thing is, he has independent existence. He's not contingent. So Chelsea's babies are contingent. They don't have to be here. My children don't have to exist. My wife brought them, and I was there too, I guess. We brought them into existence. They're contingent. Their existence depends upon my existence. Does that make sense? God is not like that. In the ancient world, they were like that. Their gods were birthed, and they exist because some other force or power brought them into existence. Not Yahweh.
I have a dumb question.
There's no dumb question.
Okay.
What? Very good question. He's not the God we're talking about. I'm not there yet. Correct. Right now, I'm particularly talking about...
I'm sorry.
This is good. This is good. See, it's a good question. I'm focusing on... I'm primarily focusing on the biblical concept of who we would call God the Father. Later on, I want to make that real distinct. Father, Son, Spirit. So I'm sorry if that's causing confusion. Right now I'm trying to keep God in generic, Yahweh in general terms, and I'm going to break it down. I'm sorry. So everything I'm talking about now would fall under the category of God the Father. But it's true that these other things, these characteristics are true. It is true that God the Son is personal and God the Spirit is personal. It is true that God the Son and Spirit are completely free. Does that make sense? These characteristic traits do, in fact, relate to God the Father, Son, and Spirit. When Jesus came into earth through Mary's womb, Jesus embodied his incarnation, coming into flesh, is contingent upon a human mother. That's a good question. That makes sense? But it's not but a standard understanding of Jesus' divinity, his godlikeness, his God-kind, is that his soul was divine. His soul was God. But his flesh was like you and me. So, unlike us, I think, this is Christianity. Christians have been divided through history whether our souls are created brand new when we're born, or conceived or sometime, or somehow our soul is kind of passed down all the way from Adam, passed down some kind of soulish way somehow. My view is that they're created brand new. Not with Jesus. Jesus' soul was not created brand new. It came with him. It was prepackaged. He took on flesh. Does that make sense? So his soul existed as God the Son from before the universe ever existed. And later on, I'll talk more about that. So it's okay. I hope it's okay if I keep repeating this. That's okay. Before the universe, imagine there's no universe. There is still God, the Father, Son, and Spirit. God the Father, Son, Spirit. When the Son takes on flesh and gets born in Bethlehem, we gave him a name. Jesus. But before then, he didn't have a name. So right now, these character traits are from the Old Testament. But if I put all the Bible verses, I could put a bunch of New Testament too, and see this relates to Father, Son, and Spirit. So if you said, well, David, is Jesus' power absolute? The answer is yes, because he's God. Is the Spirit's power absolute? Yes, because he's God. Well, is Jesus personal? Yep. Is the Spirit? Yep. See, I'm going on the list here? So it all, because they're all God. You say, well, David, I don't understand that. Okay, stick in with me on the next several weeks. I'm telling you, it's going to make more sense. That needs to sink in, because these are good character traits. So God is not contingent. God the Father, Son, and Spirit are not contingent upon someone else. Let me say it this way. If a contingent's too big of a word you don't use much, God the Father, Son, and Spirit don't have parents. They don't have parents. There's no God the Father doesn't have granddaddy. They don't come from somewhere. They just exist. They just exist. Other ancient people thought that about their gods, though. They did have parents, but not Yahweh. So he's independent existence means God has no parents. He's just not contingent on anybody. He doesn't need a babysitter. Always will be. That's right. That's good. That's right. In that sense, you might say eternal. I guess I could add that too. While a few feminine metaphors are used of Yahweh, you remember a metaphor analogy? God is like this. They use feminine stuff like a mother hen. There are some metaphors used. Only a few, though. And really, I mean only a few. I think I have every reference to it. Deuteronomy 32:11, Hosea 13:8, Isaiah 42:14, 49:15, 66:13. That's it, as far as I know. The metaphors. But when it talks about God specifically, only masculine pronouns and terms are used. Though technically he's only called God Father one time, Deuteronomy 32:6. So why is God always referred to as a he? He, him. You could throw in a couple metaphors like God's a mother hen. Okay, great. But in general, they always say he. And in Hebrew, the way they write the term, it's masculine. It's always masculine. In the ancient world, that's not true. The gods could be male or female, just like us. And the females had very high prominence. The goddesses gave birth to whole universes, or you might say creation, people groups, other gods. They were very powerful. Why in the world did these Jews say, no, God doesn't have a lover, doesn't have a wife, doesn't have a sugar mama, baby mama. That stuff doesn't happen. There's only God. And we call him a he. And say, why is he? You hate the women? Probably not. And the reason why is because, again, in the ancient world, had they said she, that would have been received very well. Well, we like she's too. We like Asherah. That's Baal's lover. Well, she would have been received very well. Does that make sense? All ancient people were patriarchal. All ancient people thought that father was the main figure. Well, and mother would have been a good deal. So why do that? One author said this, and in scholarship, I think this is pretty common. How do you keep the concept that God is transcendent? He's different from creatures, not literally up. I'm doing my hand up here, but he's not literally. He's other than. He's transcendent. He's not a creature like us. He's not contingent. He wasn't created. So he's transcendent. At the same time, he's a person. Well, I think you would have to say he. If you say she, it can be a slippery slope to not being as transcendent because we might have been birthed by her. Do you hear that? We might have come from her. So if I want to keep it real distant, again, think of it this way. I am more transcendent to my children than Elaine is. Now, the DNA, that worked out pretty well. But the actual process, they're in that sense a little more related because they grew up in her womb. I'm a little more removed. A little bit more, you might think of it that way. I'm a little more transcendent. And it probably is the case the Jews are trying to say, when we experience God, we do not experience him as a she. We weren't birthed by him. That's not what happened. God just spoke into existence. And I don't want y'all to think that we come from him like that's not how it happened. But yeah, he is a person. But we didn't birth us, and that's probably why. But the Bible never says, here's why he's a he. Here's why we use the term. It doesn't explain it. So we just have to do our best educated guess of. But I do not think it's because they hate women. That's not a compelling argument at all. It would have been received very well in the ancient world. They're going, oh, good, yeah. He, she, yeah, no big deal. No, they really thought. A little footnote, Jesus repeatedly refers to God as Father and He. That's the only way he talks about it. So you don't hate women if you say God and you say He. It doesn't mean you're a misogynist. It just means you're following the example of Jesus, who primarily understood in that way. He reveals himself in unique episodes in history. Ancient people thought, like Baal, they would either literally would come to life and die, or they would born and die, or they would go to sleep. They follow the fertility cults, right? Just like crops do. And Lord, I'm learning a lot about crops being in Kansas. So the seasons come and go, or the grass, you burn the grass and it gets reborn. You burn the grass every year over and over and over. That's what they thought the gods did. They really thought that. They would have to wake up the gods by having a fertility sex fest to wake up. They really did. They wake up the gods that way and say, hey, time to bring the crops back. And they did it every year over and over and over. It's a cycle. It's the rhythm. It's a Christmas, Easter kind of rotation. It's just the way it happened. Yahweh said, no, that's not how it works. I don't come by next season like you saw me last time. That's very, very different. It is unique. It's every time God shows up, there are unique episodes in history. He did this with this. They did it with Noah. They did it with Abraham. They did blank. So it's predictable in that he's the same person. But he's unpredictable. He don't always going to show up. And then he shows it to Abraham. Leave your people and go, what? Where'd you come from? I didn't think to see either. Moses is going to Mount Sinai. There's a burning bush. Hey, what's up? And so you have this, it's the same person talking. They don't go, well, who are you? My name's Bob. I'm different. Well, I thought you were like my cousin. He met Yahweh. No, that's different. No, it's the same person. They keep meeting over and over, but it's unique historical times. Then he goes to Moses, let my people go. You see what I'm saying? That is unique. No one thought that way about their gods. And that's really cool to me. God has perfect moral character. Ancient gods did not have moral character. They were just as evil, despicable, deceptive, lustful, prideful, you might say sinful as anybody else. And Yahweh had perfect moral character. It's a constant drum beaten in the Bible that his ways are right. By the way, that's why he has the moral right to make commandments. To make commandments. Why? Because they're right. You got to do them because he's just right. He forms formal relationships and is jealous of any act that worships other gods, like we talked about. I'm a jealous God. Other gods did not talk that way. They didn't get jealous because there are a bunch of gods out there. They might want particular honor. Chelsea better give me a particular dance, a particular incense, but I'm not mad if you go to the next temple down the street because we're all up here together, all the gods. And here comes the Jews. Have you gone crazy? You don't go down the street to the next woman? He wants you alone, and that's unique in the ancient world. That's a formal relationship. They didn't talk about jealousy. They just didn't do it. Last two, he is utterly unlike humans in there, and I put fickleness, failings, and frailty. I just only F-fest there. Oh, I did it again, F-fest. Oh my goodness. I can't stop. Like lust, sexuality, deception, all the other gods were like that. He's unlike the humans that way. He's like humans that we have free will, right? That kind of sense. But he's unlike us in all the bad parts. He's not fickle. He's not just, I want to zap them. I'm going to kill them. I don't want to talk to them for 500 years. Or they hurt my feelings. He's just not like that. And again, every other people group talked about their gods that way. It was like a soap opera. And the last but not least, and I'll stop for any question or comments and we're done, he's utterly dependable and faithful. The Hebrew word is chesed. He's loyal no matter what. All you have to do is say, I'm sorry. You just repent. If you're in the Old Testament, you say, I blew it. He'll let you come back home. He's not going to give up on you. He's so faithful to the covenant. And other ancient gods were not like that. If you do not say the right program, the right prayer, the right incense, the right sacrifice, they could just bail on you. There's no guarantee. The gods were mad all the time. Didn't get your crop in, they're ticked off at you. Baby died, you did something wrong. You must not have said that the incense didn't burn right, whatever it was. That's not the Yahweh. It's a constant drum. Now, if you, I didn't just for time. Beside every bullet point I just listed, I could give you just tons of Bible verses. We could look up all of them. I guess I'm sorry if I just say, can you trust me? This is a common, this is it. So these are ways, again, back to my analogy, Chelsea time travels and she sits back and she says all this. Let me tell you about Yahweh. And she didn't say, let me tell you about his being and his essence, but she said, let me tell you how he behaves. Let me tell you about his character. He is absolutely powerful. He has absolute free will. He loves us and he wants a formal relationship. He gets ticked off and jealous if I worship some other God. And he lists that foreign person would have gone, cuckoo, she's gone crazy. Yeah, I mean, they're just radically different ways of understanding reality. I have not said one word about Jesus yet. I'm going to. I'm not trying to be confusing. I also haven't talked about his spirit. I'm going to talk about that too. Right now, I'm just trying to emphasize he's one God. And then here's some traits. Next week, I want to get into a little more about this sense of wisdom or word, which will come on. It'll help us understand Jesus better. And then the spirit. That'll be next week. But before I go there, any questions or comments at all on this material? Gotcha. So what do we do with an Abraham and if God has free will, what do we do with the Abrahamic episode where he pleads for Sodom and Gomorrah? Can I find just 20, just 10, just one? He still has the freedom to say, forget you. I don't give a rip what you're trying to make a deal with me is. You don't control me. And that's what I'm trying to get at. No one compels him or controls or manipulates him. What we find in the Old Testament and the New Testament, what's so amazing when you read it in ancient culture, and it didn't hit me until I started reading other ancient cultures, scholars who study it years ago. And that is, what's so amazing is he has what we call a dialectic approach with humans. He'll work with them. He'll work with them. And so if you repent, well, I won't kill the city. Or I guess if you really want that, I'll let you have it. I didn't want that at first, but now that you really asked me, okay. There's a genuine freedom of the human to request, and there's a freedom in God to grant it if he wants to. Does that make sense? So it's not determined. It's just, that's a good point. And I don't think the point of the text is that he's telling God something he doesn't already know. I think it's something very different point. That is, it's so corrupt, there aren't enough righteous people. And so God doesn't learn that. Abraham learns. He starts, that is to say, in the give and take process, he realizes, oh snap, I'm running out of, okay, how about 10? Oh, wait, no, now I think about it, can I just... So I think the point of the narrative isn't God didn't know it. I think it's a very different point. The point is, it's so corrupt. But the second thing is, in the Old Testament, Abraham does, and like Moses, shares a very special relationship with God. We don't have in the Old Testament examples of any old Jew talking and debating with God about how to do it. We have certain characters who really have a special. Now, why is that? Probably because they had a covenant with God. Abraham made a covenant with God. Moses made a covenant with God. David made a covenant with God. And those VIPs seem to have the ability to have a kind of formal personal relationship that is unlike others. It's mediated through the others, but it's not them.
Not like in...
Yeah, Moses is talking to God saying, hey, don't leave us out here. It'll make you look bad.
Yeah.
Again, but in the Old Testament, the narrative, it's trying to demonstrate God does dialogue with these people, and he takes their views in consideration. In scholarship, we have a term for, it's kind of a fancy term, comes from the Latin, from the Greek, called anthropomorphism. That is to say, you use qualities, characteristics of God, and you describe it in human-like terms. For example, in the Old Testament, the most common way to say God is mad is it says God's nostrils smoked. That's literally what it says in Hebrew, and his nostrils, like a bull. You know, go out in Kansas when it's the other day when it was -5, and it hurts to breathe in, but you could see every bit of my breath barely doing it. Well, that's the analogy of a cow or a bull that's snorting out its whatever. God doesn't literally have nostrils. That's an anthropomorphism, or that more like what they call a beastmorphism, but like an animal parallel, an animal analogy. So translations just say, and God was very angry. But sometimes they'll say, and God lifted him up with his right hand. But nobody thinks God the Father has a hand or a right arm. No, I mean, think about that. Never in the Bible does anyone ever, even though it consistently uses right hand. No one ever thinks he has a right hand because he's not a creature. It's an anthropomorphism. It's a way of saying my strong right hand is to say I have strength. I will rescue you, to Moses, with my strong right hand. And when Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father, it doesn't mean literally he's up there on the right. God the Father doesn't have a right. It's a place of authority. And so when he debates them and has dialogue, most scholars would say it's demonstrating again the author of the text is trying to say in such a way that we understand that he's relatable. And then we use terms and ideas like memory or forgot, or sometimes we might say God repented, that is, he changed his mind. It's anthropomorphism. It's a way of saying he can dialogue with them, and I'm trying to use vocabulary to help you understand what happened. But he still had free will. He still had free will. Make sure you understand. He still had the freedom to say no or yes. It does show his mercy. Yeah, that's another part of the narrative. The dialogue shows the mercy. But there are texts, it seems to imply that the human creature is giving God information he didn't know about. It does seem, I agree, I've read those texts before. And that's certainly possible. That's what the editor of the story is trying to convey. That's possible. I don't find it compelling because we have an overwhelming amount of verses that demonstrate that he knows all things and whatever. So I tend to look at alternate explanations versus, is he really trying to explain something, or is he just trying to get at the fact that God's relatable and blah, 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 blah. But that's certainly possible. And even those stories that happen, which I'm saying I'm with you, they're very few. But they're still there. They still matter.
I think that's why it always felt weird.
It feels weird. And I'm not trying to skip over it. I'm not skipping over it because it's in the Bible. I'm just saying that's good. And I think the so what is different from they really taught God something he didn't know. That's my view. Anything else?
And God spoke, the Word of God is Jesus Christ. So,
yeah, and I want to, what you just said is very good. I want to unpack that in the next few weeks. Chelsea and all that, what she's talking about is when it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1, the very first verse of the whole Bible. The word God in Hebrew is Elohim. El means God. Ohim, it means S. It's plural. Gods. So literally is, in the beginning gods created the heavens and the earth. But Elohim became shorthand for God. So in the Old Testament, there are many ways to say the word God. El, singular. You can say Elohim. You can say Yahweh. You can say Adon, which means Lord. Adonai means my Lord. There's different ways to say it. So what she's saying is, if it's plural, a lot of the churches teach that's the Trinity.
right.
Father, Son, and Spirit. I don't find that compelling at all for several reasons. One is, there's no evidence in the Old Testament they believed in a Trinity, Father, Son, and Spirit. I do think we have the early stages or seeds of what would develop into it. And I'll show you where later on. Like His Word, His wisdom, and then, of course, the Spirit. Absolutely. But that's a far cry from Jesus Christ. And the second thing I'd say is, so I don't think Trinity is that early. I think the Jews would have thought, I think about time travel and said, do you believe in God the Father, Son, and Spirit? I think they would have gone, cuckoo, you've gone crazy. I don't think they had that conception. It doesn't mean it's not true. It just means I don't think ancient Jews thought that way yet. And in Christian theology, we call this progressive revelation, that God revealed more of Himself over time. He revealed more of Himself over time. And that's a standard Orthodox Christian view. Not everyone has to believe it, but it is a standard view that God deliberately revealed more of Himself. Now think about it, even back in Genesis, they didn't know who Jesus was, because Jesus, and that's my second major point, Jesus was the name for the incarnated Word. And that little footnote, and maybe I'll repeat myself later on when we get to Jesus, that's why I do not find it compelling at all to talk about like the three and Daniel in the fire den. That must have been Jesus helping them out. I never remember the first one. Shadrach. I never remember the first one. That's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And this angel's inside. We say, oh, that's Jesus. Well, I don't find that compelling. Jesus isn't here yet. He has to be incarnated. The incarnation is a really big deal. So I don't think the Word, or His wisdom, or the Logos, showed up in angelic form before the incarnation. Well, if I can say it one more time, and again, I'm going to say this a lot more fully when we get to Jesus. That's right. If you notice it back to Chelsea's question earlier when I said, we were talking about Jesus, I said, before the universe existed, before He created anything, there was Father, Son, and Spirit. Father, Son, and Spirit.
It just wasn't revealed to Jew.
Correct. So, no doubt, Father, Son, and Spirit existed. The Son didn't have the name Jesus until Bethlehem. He didn't get a name. And so in Christian theology, And if you notice, I will always use that term specific because we were trained, nuance it. I never ever will say God the Father, Jesus, and the Spirit. I will never do that. Because Jesus is talking about when he got incarnated from Bethlehem and grew up and lived in Palestine. So he's the Son made flesh. The Son's name becomes Jesus. But he was the Son before then. He always existed. So, and we'll talk more about that later on. We will. Don't be discouraged. We're going to talk a little more about that later on. But it's a good point. What do we do with the plural? If it's Elohim, what do we do with the plural? Most scholars say the plural is what we might call a plural of majesty. When the queen says, "Let us go to dinner," she doesn't think she's more than one person. Another explanation is that the plural represents God and his hosts, God and his angelic armies. That there's, again, you say, well, are there angelic armies there all the time? Well, if you're an ancient Jew, they said, yeah, of course there is. I mean, every king has their armies, but that's a different issue. Yes, that's it. Very good. Let us make image. You'll hear in churches, that's the Trinity. I don't know Old Testament scholar I know of ever will find that compelling, and I don't find that compelling either. Most would say the let us is just either a plural of majesty, like a queen talking about herself in the plural, in that sense like she represents the people, or it's Yahweh and his hosts. And God of hosts is a very common appellation or title for God in the Old Testament. The God of hosts. I am the God of hosts. Host, of course, just means army, right? Angelic beings, an army. And so most would say that's all they have in mind. That a Jew would have heard that, let us, and go, of course, it's him and his supreme council of angels. Not really his council, like his advice, but yeah, nevertheless, his host, his angelic.
Spirit and the Word still work within an ancient world.
Correct. Very good. So the Word, God's Word, and His Spirit still work in the ancient world. Absolutely.
The Spirit came upon and took away.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Then the question, though, that's exactly right. Even in Genesis, the Spirit hovered over the waters. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm not denying at all that the Father and His Word and the Spirit are all present. Absolutely. That will pave the way for the Trinity. It will pave the way. Jews had it from the very beginning. And I'll talk a lot more about that next time. Because next week I want to talk about... No, Trinity's always there. The distinction I'm making is this, and I'll stop. The distinction I'm making is this. And it's an important distinction. I'm not trying to be just nerdy about it, but I'm just trying to be distinctive here. The question is, did ancient Jews have that conception?
And they did.
That's one question. Yeah. It's another question to ask, did the author of Genesis have that understanding? Okay. It's another question to ask, what really existed back then? Forget God. Did ancient people believe in black holes? Quantum theory? Of course they did not. No, they didn't know that stuff. They thought the earth and moon was a burst in the firmament, and the glory of God was shining through. They didn't have a daggone, or as an angel. They didn't have a clue what it was. Was it true that black holes and the stars existed out there even though we didn't know it? Yeah. We didn't know it existed until the Hubble telescope took pictures, but it still existed. But if I were to read let's change analogy. If I were to read a science paper or a book 50 years ago about the outer world and go, yeah, they said they called it this, but now we know it's really Venus or a galaxy or Pluto's not really a planet, poor old Pluto, those kind of things. Do you see my point? That's how it goes to Genesis. So what was revealed to them took time. What really existed, now we look back and go, it really was Father, Son, and Spirit. Right. But I don't want to read into them and make them say something they never said. Do you see the distinction?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be nerdy about it. I'm just trying to make sure they speak for themselves.
Yeah.
Well, like in Genesis 1, the serpent's tempted. Well, that's Satan. Well, Genesis didn't say it's Satan. Does that mean evil was never around? That's a different question. Yeah. Did Genesis say that? And I'm trying to be fair to what they said. Does that?
Yeah.
So God revealed more over time, kind of like we know more about the stars because we have a telescope. Yeah. Good. Anything else? Anything else? So we're done? In the Bible, when God says, and God said, are we supposed to take that as a direct quote from God? If I asked an ancient person, let's say someone from the time of Jesus, all the way before then, so any time, let's just call that ancient world, 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, all the way 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century BC, way back then. If I time travel and ask that question, I think wholeheartedly would say yes. Yes. In the last couple hundred years in Christian reflection, several hundred, they would probably nuance that. Some group of Christians would say the answer is yes, absolutely. That's fine. I'm not against that. There's a long trajectory of Christians saying that. There's also a large trajectory of Christians saying, well, yes and no. The no part is to say the more commonly orthodox view is that God spoke to them and then the speaker, the human, used language, analogies, metaphors, images, symbols that would have made sense to their audience and did their best to convey what they thought God was telling them. So the distinction is, did God tell them to use that analogy, or did Isaiah come up with it? You see the distinction? Both would say you're getting God's point across. But the question is, was the kernel of the message the same? Is the same no matter what? The issue is, yeah, the kernel, or is it more than that? All the details? That's option one. The answer is wholeheartedly yes. Option two is, no, the kernel stood there, but there was a human free will element involved. And God He knew that. They had the free will to use their God-given brain to do the best job they could to say, what communicates to these people what I know to be true?
The best way we know how.
Be no different from us trying to communicate.
Well, if we have a truth, and we're trying to
that's what people,
tell you what it is.
many people argue that it is no different from us. They would say is that's what they did back then. They were convinced God gave them a message, and they thought, well, how do I get this? How do I convey this? Most scholarship, most even evangelical scholars the last couple hundred years would side with option two. So when we read the Apostle Paul, you read the Gospels, the Gospel authors and editors, and they read that, they would say, most Christians will say it's inspired, but that doesn't mean God told them exactly what words to use. And that's a big issue. That's called plenary inspiration, like divine dictation. They just kind of got into a trance, and they just said, I got to use the exact words, and that's it. That's one view, and that's a legitimate view. But also a legitimate view is that no, that there was a human-divine mix.
And we're never going to know the answer for sure until you're face to face.
That's
I don't know how we can know
that.
that. I don't know how we can know the answer for sure. Yeah. I tend to go the second route, in my view, because to me it tends to make more sense of the text more often than not. If I read Paul in Romans and I go, why did he say that versus, and then God said, I go, well, Paul said it. I think Paul thought he was telling truth, but I don't know if I would have said the same way Paul did, but for his audience, I get it. Does that make, there's just times if it's problematic, I go, well, that's because he was doing the best he could or whatever, versus to say, but others say, no, David, they will. They'll get, even a podcast, they may get very, very ticked off. That's heresy. God said every word. He spoke every word. No, end of story. Well, that is a view. But bottom line is, I think it's just as authoritative. I just got to interpret it different. It's just, I live my life by it. And so, great question. That's the best I got.